Good morning, everybody. Very nice to be with you, and thank you for joining us. I just want to share a few slides with you, and they should be on your screen now. For me, the critical thing about economic growth is not the growth on its own. It is growth in comparison to population growth, and those who know my work will know that I've taken this view for a long time. So it's about economic growth minus population growth. Economic growth is about making cash flow, making money, but you're making money, or the quantum of money that you make is influenced by how many babies you're making. So what you see on the screen is a timeline of more or less 45 years from 1975 all the way to 2020. And what those blue bars will show us is the 12 months periods in which we got richer. In other words, where economic growth was higher than population growth. And the bars going down to the bottom are the bars where we got poorer. Economic growth was less than population growth. And as you can see clearly on the slide, there was a long period, about 2 decades, from the middle 70s to the middle 90s, where we got poorer. And we got poorer by a margin of about 11%, which is quite a substantial number. I say quite substantial because this is an after-inflation number. Inflation has been ripped out of these figures. And then you can see from the middle 90s to about 2014, we've had quite a nice recovery. And the country got richer by 33%. There were some setbacks in that period. You can see in 1998, the blue bar is going downwards. And you can see in 2008, the blue bar also goes downwards. Those were the 2 years where we had international crises, and South Africa was affected by those crises as well. But there's no denying that in general, the period from the mid-90s to 2014, a period of about 21 years, we got substantially wealthier. And, as I always say to South Africans, where do you think umhlanga comes from? 3 decades ago or so, those were just cane fields. Where do you think Sandton comes from? Where do you think the property prices in the Western Cape comes from? I was talking to a farmer yesterday who bought a farm 20 years ago for 8 million rand, and that farm was now valued at 125 million by the bank. He's done a lot of improvements and capital works and so on, but that's the kind of thing that happens when you've got a 33% rise, or 33% increase in per capita incomes. What you can also see on the screen is that starting in 2015, for the 5 years to 2019, I know it sounds like 4, but count them on your fingers. From 2015 to 2019, 5 years, our per capita incomes, our economy stagnated, and per capita incomes declined by about 3%. So we got poorer again. So that long run that we had after the democracy have certainly been interrupted and turned around. Not turned around in a train smash way, but certainly turned around. Where the train smash is destined to come in will be in 2020. We don't know at this stage yet. The year is not over. But the expectation is that by the end of this year, per capita incomes will probably be about 11% lower than what they were in December last year. So we're taking a huge whack, make no mistake. Even at minus 3%, you're taking a whack. For some people, it's an immaterial number. The income has gone up, they're living better. Other people have lost their jobs. They've been retrenched. Their businesses have been closed down. People who've managed to hang on to their jobs and hang on to their businesses have not seen an increase in income. So the minus 3% is not just a number. It illustrates the real life outside there on the streets. And therefore, the minus 11, which is the anticipated figure for 2020, is really quite a serious whack. Let me just explain how we get to that minus 11. The assumption is that the economy will shrink, will contract by 9.5%, and then our population growth is about 1.5%. So you add that on, and you end up with a minus 11 figure. This is the most serious number since 1921. It is even more serious than the 1929 depression. The depression is well known of 1929, and people refer to it and so on. At that point, the decline was about -8%. But in fact, a few years earlier in 1921, we had a bigger decline. We had a decline of about 14, 15%. And that was because there was a very serious drought in South Africa in 1921, and that contracted the economy and pushed incomes down. So this is the worst. This -11 for 2020 is the worst since 1921. We can talk about the worst in 100 years. So that is where we are at the moment. We were in trouble, economically speaking, for 5 years before the COVID epidemic struck us. Now the COVID epidemic has struck us, or pandemic, and now we're sitting with probably a -11% number for this year. It's a forecast, but I think it's a reasonable one. It comes from the Bureau of Economic Research at Stellenbosch. So the first point, what is the impact of the COVID pandemic? The first one is it aggravates by a wide margin the troubles that we had in any case before the pandemic struck. So on slide number 2, Mabila, on slide number 2, what I've just spoken about there, the first bullet, there's going to be a 9 to 10% contraction. I give you the reference to 29 and 21. So that's the first fact, or first consequence of COVID-19. The second consequence is, I think there's little doubt that COVID is going to cause a huge debt crisis. When do you have a debt crisis? You have it when income is not enough to service debt. And that applies to a government, to a company, a business, and to individuals and individual households. When your income is no longer enough to service your debt commitments, to pay the interest and to repay capital, then you've got to get a debt crisis. And the world will still have to work through this. And the third consequence is that I think the COVID crisis has strengthened the position of President Ramaphosa considerably. Nedbank Private Wealth distributed a note on that in May, and there we quote various poll numbers and so on. There's no question that if the president was before this pandemic started 60-40 in charge of his party, then I think it's safe to say he's now probably 70-75% in charge of his party. He's very far away from that 48% with 48-52 margin with which he was elected 2.5 years ago at Nasrec. I know in the course of April and May, a lot of fake news has gone around saying that he will be kicked out, or he has even been kicked out by the ANC. He will be replaced by NDZ, he will be recalled, and so on. Frankly, Trevor, that is all rubbish. None of that is true, and on the contrary, I think the COVID pandemic has helped him. The fourth consequence that I see from COVID is that there's a cohesion and an urgency around economic growth. And you would have seen it in the last few days, empirical evidence of that, when the ANC released a 34-slide document on which they talk about economic reconstruction and how they want to do it. But it's not just that. You can listen to the Minister of Finance. You can follow what the President himself says. I think there's a very real realization now that we're in deep trouble and we need to do something about the economy and do that urgently. Now, that's a plus in a political sense. The last point I want to make about the consequences of COVID is the fact that we mustn't forget that at the end of March, we were finally downgraded by Moody's, and at the end of April, we were finally kicked out of the World Global Bond Index. And everybody predicted the end of life as we know it when that occurrence happens. Well, it has happened. It is not the end of life. We've not gone to the IMF as many people has predicted, and others have hoped. Some others have feared. What is coming out clearly, and that's a lesson from the COVID pandemic, is we survived not just COVID, but we also survived the downgrade at the same time. I think that's quite a compliment. That's quite a compliment for the stability and the strength and how deep the South African financial markets are. And the fact that we could weather it, is something to bear in mind. Our long rates now are virtually back where they were before the downgrade, in spite of COVID. The currency is still weaker, and that's one of the things that one would expect in conditions like this. And it is, in a sense, a minor price to pay for the changes that has occurred. So that is where we are, and that is, I was asked to talk a little bit about the safe consequences. Let's go a step further now to slide 3, Nabila, and just look at how are we going to get out of this low growth scenario in which we are. Now, there are a number of bullets on the screen. Let me just talk to them one by one. I think the first point to make is that fiscal and monetary stimulation at the moment is not really possible unless you are willing to print money. Now, both the government and the Reserve Bank, both the politicians as well as the technocrats, have made it clear that we're not going to print money. There are people who believe that it should be done. Julius Malema is one. You're welcome to follow his economic advice if you want to. The chances of printing money to get out of where we are is really not very high. The second point that is important is we need to maintain. It's really linked to number one. We need to maintain a stable and a predictable macroeconomic policy. So your fiscal policy and your monetary policy must be. You must know where you're going, and people must know what they can expect. Now, the governor has made very clear where he stands, and we know where we stand with the Reserve Bank and with interest rates. We're getting a new budget on 24 June, another 2 weeks or 3 weeks to go, and that budget will give us detail of where we stand on the fiscal policy post-COVID. Obviously, the budget that we got in February is no longer relevant. It's really no longer relevant. So it's about where we're going now that we're in the middle of the epidemic. So you cannot print money. That's not open to us. You have to maintain a stable macroeconomic policy framework. And the evidence that we've done that is in the 500 billion rand COVID relief, which the president announced. Of that 500 billion, only around about 95 billion rand extra has to be borrowed. It's actually quite a clever package if you can do relief for 500 billion at the cost of only borrowing 90 billion more. And we will get that 90 in all likelihood from the 4 financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the BRICS Bank, and the African Development Bank. And I think the BRICS Bank one is the furthest advanced. They talk about $1.5 billion, and the IMF has already said that South Africa can access 4.2 billion. And these fundings or these monies is to be used for fighting COVID. Now, the third bullet, I think, is really the key point. If we want to get out of the low growth in which we're stuck, then we have to do a lot of structural reform in the economy. Now, structural reform is one of those things. It means different things to different people. For some people, it means that you have to privatize everything. For other people, it means that you have to abolish labor laws in the labor market and just allow the labor market to run without any regulation. For a third group of people, it would mean we've got to print money. That's more to the left of the political spectrum. There you have a group of people who say structural reform is to abandon the inflation target, print money, and finance the budget deficit through the Reserve Bank. A fourth group of people would say it's all about exports. So create special economic zones, and then you can follow China and Vietnam and Singapore and export, and that's the way you get richer. There are about 25 different schools on what structural reform means for different schools and different groups of people. For me, it's very simple. A structural reform, and this is how it is treated in the literature as well, is any action that increases or it improves productivity. It's as simple as that. If you can increase productivity, then do so. Follow whatever actions will bring you that result. And in South Africa, we need a proper injection of productivity increases. Now, what I've done then, just for your reference, I've summarized the Treasury paper on structural reform, because that's where Treasury's thinking is. And what Treasury has done is to identify 5 key growth reform areas. And there they are. You can see them. I'm not going to read through them. That is what they've identified as the areas in our national life, in our economy, where we have to do reforms to increase productivity. I want to focus on the first one only, and then in fact only on half of the first one. Modernizing network industries. This is now both in government and in ANC. This is a big theme that we can't carry on with electricity, with our network industries, which in the way that we have been carrying on. We have to change that. And that then includes transport, water, energy, and spectrum release or telecommunications. I'm going to talk only about energy and electricity this morning and briefly about spectrum. Why? Because I think that's where things are the furthest advanced. The others, take for example, the one item there, prioritizing growth in labor-intensive sectors like agriculture and tourism. Well, tourism is dead. And those of you involved in agriculture will know that agriculture is moving more and more capital intensive. So to talk about labor intensity, I think you'll have to wait long before you get results. So I want to focus on energy because I think things have progressed very far there. It's quite clear that the ANC and government and unions are aligned, which is important, which is an important political backdrop, and then spectrum release. So on slide number four, heading energy, you really only have to go back to 2 documents. The one was about 60 pages, the other one about 66 pages, I think, if I remember correctly, that were published in October 2019. So that's about, 9 months ago. And those 2 documents dealt with South Africa's integrated resource plan, how we see energy developing over the next 10 to 30 years. And the second document dealt with Eskom. And here is the key summary. In terms of the IRP, it stipulates that over the 11 years from 2019 to 2030, 30,000 megawatt of electricity, new electricity capacity must be installed. And then on this line there, you can see that 48% of that new capacity is envisaged. It will come from wind, 20% from solar. Gas will make a contribution of 10%, hydro 8%, storage, that's basically a battery technology, and hydro storage will do 7%, excuse me. And coal is the smallest contribution, 5%. Now, if you just, and why do we have to create this 11,000 megawatts of new capacity? Well, we have to create it because 11,000 megawatts of current coal-fired power stations, of current Eskom power stations, will have to be decommissioned. First, they're old and they cannot be run efficiently anymore. 2, they are huge contributors to carbon emissions, and South Africa has commitments under the Paris Agreement to reduce our carbon emissions. 3, the maintenance of those things is A, difficult, and B, expensive. So there's general agreement, and Andre de Ruyter has confirmed this, the Eskom CEO, that this 11,000 megawatts will be decommissioned over the next few years. What do you replace it with? Well, you replace it with wind, solar, gas, and the other items that I've shown there for you. So there's a massive change coming in our energy industry. We're going from a situation where 95% of our electricity is provided by Eskom to a situation where less than 60% will be provided by Eskom. And with that, we're going from a situation where 95% of our energy is provided, is derived from coal, to where it will be derived from renewable sources. Not all of them will be renewable. Gas, for example, is not renewable. You can see there's a provision that they must bring in 10%, but gas is certainly a hell of a lot cleaner than coal. So in that sense, it is progress. I personally think if you look at the society around us, what we're going to see in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, is that the gas industry is going to be much, much bigger than what it is today. Just as a throwaway comment, that 5% for coal that you see there, that is in the IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan. That is what they envision. And it's largely built around 2 power stations in the Waterberg area, Tambetsi, and I can't remember the other one's name. I doubt those power stations will be built. I very much doubt it. Why do I doubt it? First of all, financial constraints. More and more banks are refusing to give money for coal-fired power stations, also in South Africa. So even if you're an entrepreneur, you may find that you will not be able to get the money. The second reason is environmental concerns. Those projects will be opposed in the courts. They will be opposed in public opinion. They will be opposed in protests from green activists. So unless there's a breakthrough in coal technology, some kind of scientific breakthrough that gives you much cleaner coal, I doubt whether that 5% will even occur. I think that 5% will be spread over the other items, over wind, solar, and hydro. Okay, you can see there on the bullet, I've really already pointed to it, that when we reach this phase of the IRP, by 2030, coal will be less than 60%, renewables will constitute 25% of our energy needs, hydro 8%, nuclear 4.5%. Where does nuclear come in? Nuclear comes in if the hydro project does not take place. So the hydro project refers to the Great Inga scheme in Central Africa. South Africa has signed the takeoff agreement, but it is subject to certain constraints and conditions. Most of those conditions must be met by 2022, which is next year. And if by next year it is clear that they will not be met, then I doubt then South Africa has got a right to step out of those contracts, step out of those agreements. And the department has indicated in that case, if we lose the hydro, they will go for nuclear. And you can see there's a provision for 4.5%. Of course, some of that nuclear will come from Kuiberg in the Western Cape, but there's also new facilities, new capacity that will be erected. And recently, about a month ago, the department has put out a request for information. And its basic stance is if there are private sector players who want to come in and build nuclear power stations, then that's fine. It's for their account, but of course it'll have to meet the test of costs. So that's really a summary in one slide of what is in store for both Eskom and the energy sector in South Africa in general. So let's go to slide 5, please, Nabila, and answer the question, what does this mean in money terms? I mean, we're talking economic growth here. So how will this electricity story, how will it influence growth? Now, you've already seen, I'm repeating the first point, 30,000 megawatts must be installed. That is in terms of the IRP. But the IRP assumes an EAF. What is EAF? What animal is that? That is basically energy availability factor. That's Eskom's efficiency. The IRP assumes an EAF of 75%. But it is running and has run now for the best part of the year at below 68%. Currently, it's running at about 67%. Now, if you make a budget, in this case, an energy budget, and you assume that something will run at 75%, but it actually runs at about 8 percentage points lower, then clearly your sums can't add up. And therefore, I'm saying Eskom will probably never get back to 75%. The plant is old, the neglect that we've had in maintenance, substantial. I doubt that we will ever get back to 75%. I think if it gets back to 70%, that will probably be a lot. Now that means more than 30,000 megawatts will have to be installed. 30,000 megawatts is the baseline. That's what we take now as the base case, and that's in the IRP. But I suspect in real life it will be closer to 32 or 33,000. Doesn't matter, just park that at the back of your mind. How much is 30,000 megawatts? The 6,000 megawatts of renewable energy that we have had so far in South Africa has brought in investment of 220 billion rand, of which 42% came from foreigners. You want to talk foreign direct investment, there is your sector, and clearly there is huge interest. If almost half of that money came from outside our borders, half of the 220 billion, it shows there is huge appetite. It's also, this appetite was confirmed in February this year when the department opened up the requests for interest, which they've received from private sector people for 2,000 megawatts. There were 481 organizations and companies interested. Now let's apply the normal 80-20 rule. Let's say 80% is chancers and bullshitters and people that you can't trust, and only 20% is genuine and real. 20% is still 90 companies, 90 organizations. So there's clearly huge interest in South Africa and outside South Africa in energy investment. Okay, so if 6,000 megawatts resulted in 220 billion rand investment, in how much investment will 30,000 megawatts result? Now, my back of a cigarette box calculation is at least 1 trillion rand, at least 1 trillion rand. And I haven't encountered any serious opposition from people who know much more than I do when I floated this amount around. People accept that if we want to build 30,000 megawatts over the next 10 years, we will have to invest about 1 trillion rand. Now that obviously can't come from government. It obviously can't come from Eskom. It will have to come from private investors. And if you then extend your cigarette box investment and your cigarette box calculation rather, and you say we want to do this investment over 10 years, let's divide the trillion by 10, then you end up with 100 billion a year. Now, how much is 100 billion a year? Well, there you have it in a bullet. South Africa's net investment in the last 2 years was about 200 billion a year. If you feel that that's too low, that we should look at the earlier period, there you've got the numbers for the 7 years before the last 2 years. It was about 211 billion. It doesn't matter which way you cut it, 100 billion on 210 billion is a massive percentage. You're looking at almost 50%. So that's the increase that South Africa can get in its net investment. And I just want to explain something here. When economists talk about investment, it is a standard procedure to talk about gross investment as a percentage of GDP. Derek Hughes taught me that one mustn't mess around with gross investment. You must deduct depreciation. So take your gross investment, deduct depreciation, and you end up with net investment, and that's the really critical number. And I like that. It's conservative. There's nothing flashy about it. Net investment, I think, is the thing to look at. And there you can see the enormous impact that it has. So if you ask me, how do we get out of this low growth scenario in which we are, then I say you restructure Eskom and you restructure, more importantly, the energy industry. How are you going to do that? Well, that is according to the IRP, which, by the way, is being implemented step by step. So in conclusion, we have the worst economic slump in 100 years. We even worse than 1929. COVID-19, I think, is doing us a favor. It is forcing the economy onto the agenda, and it's forcing the item of structural adjustment. The easiest wins, the lowest hanging fruit in structural adjustment is electricity. There's also spectrum release that I have not referred to. And again, we can talk about that, but that train is clearly steaming on, and a company like Vodacom has recently expressed their happiness with the schedule the government has. The target dates will be met, and they're looking forward to making investments. The nice thing about electricity and also spectrum is there's no problem with demand. If you run a hotel or you run a bed and breakfast or you run a B&B, your problem at the moment is you don't have demand for your product. There are no tourists or very few. So there's no demand for your product. If you're a hospital and you can't do elective surgery, well, then there's no demand for your product. That is not the case of electricity. People want electricity. They want spectrum. You must just supply it to them. They will happily take it and happily pay for it. So I think that's where the economy is going to get a kickstart. It will be on the back of investment. It will not be on the back of easy money. It will be on the back of real investment, and it holds the potential to take the South African economy back to a 2-3% growth rate. And the importance of a 2-3% growth rate, it is much more than population growth. Our population growth is about 1.5, 1.6%. So if you can grow your economy at 3, that's almost double the population growth. Well, then you can end the 6-year demographic recession that we've had, and we can look at a whole new ball game.